year 2000, Philip Simmons was making sense of what he now knew to be his short and limited life. He had just been diagnosed with ALS. He was 35 years old, a young husband and father, and he gave up the teaching job that he loved and moved home with his family. He was a man who loved his solitude and loved it no less even in that time of coming to grips with what he was dealing with. So he took up writing in his cabin, which was some 50 yards away from the house. And he also appreciated the joy of community in his small town of Sandwich, New Hampshire. Now, there are two families in this church who know Sandwich, New Hampshire fairly well, and I count myself as one of them, as the summer property that my family owns is just one town over from Sandwich. So reading his book called Learning to Fall was really lovely as it evoked all these images of this beautiful small town. It's another one of these towns that has just one blinking light in the center of town, a post office, a few shops, and a little general store. Simmons writes that the trip to the post office and general store became a social adventure for him. And for this, he writes, "I'm happy to come out of my cave, as I am reminded of the enlivening force of community. This winter, I've spent a good deal of part of most of each day alone in my 10 by 12 cabin, meditating, reading, and writing. So much of spiritual life involves one's inner journey, and yet, for most of us, spirituality gets expressed, even transformed, only in our relationships to others." Now, it may be that Jesus' retreat to solitude right after his baptism had some similar motivations in it. Here is a person with some weighty journey before him, that he will be cast into the life of community with all its clanging and chaos, all its judgment and joys, all its pain and poignancy. Now, you may remember the story we call the Temptations with its details. That's not what we heard today. Mark has a spare account where Matthew and Luke's gospel fill it up with a lot of dialogue between Jesus and the devil and name very specific temptations. In contrast to this 10 and 8 verse long description of this time of solitude, Mark keeps it to just 2 verses. "And the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with wild beasts, and the angels waited on him." Mark will give the devil no more time, no more ink than the beasts and the angels. And this description is really less about temptation than it is about solitude. A rich inner landscape that can at times be punishing, to be sure, but is more renewing and perhaps even transforming. which is exactly what Henry Nouwen, Catholic priest, theologian, professor at Yale and Harvard Divinity Schools, and one of the greatest witnesses and writers about the spiritual life, will say. Recently, the adult Bible study group finished reading one of Nouwen's books called The Way of the Heart, in which Nouwen names solitude as the furnace of transformation. The furnace of transformation that enables us to turn away from the false ego-driven self, the compulsive self, and turn to the real Christ-centered self that we are intended to be. He notes that society is not always radiant with the love of Christ, but is a dangerous network of domination and manipulation and sin in which we can easily get entangled and lose our way. Solitude, Nouwen will note, is not the same as privacy, in which we are left alone with our own complaints and convictions and don't have to deal with anybody else's ideas or thoughts or patterns or quirks. Rather, in solitude, we take account of our own petty desires, lazy platitudes, and angry judgments. Solitude is not a kind of spiritual property. It's not even a therapeutic self-help method. Solitude is space left open for the relationship to God. In solitude, it's our job to keep our minds open for the movement of God, to face into that mystery we know as God. Solitude is where we are converted and transformed, confronted with the capriciousness of human nature and all the ways that we are compelled to control or cry out, all the ways that the changing and challenging nature of our lives appear to us. In solitude, we get to see the compulsions that we have inside us for what they are and can turn away from these and instead turn to face God. Now, Nouwen's work gives us a way to understand this story of Mark, this story of Jesus walking into solitude. And the image of wilderness here is not intended to evoke in particular a physical space, but is the wilderness within. The wilderness that, if we're honest, is really swaths of our own personalities, which are out of control at times and not domesticable. When we discover this work of the inner wilderness wandering, it enables us to be less reactive and more present to others, more capable of listening deeply, more accepting, and more loving. So Philip Simmons notes that nothing serves relationships, families, or community better than a well-cultivated solitude. These two forms of life, Simmons goes on to say, communal and solitary, are mutually self-sustaining. The 35-year-old Simmons helps us to give some insight into the story of the 30-year-old Jesus going into the wilderness, needing to empty himself of all previously held dear plans, ambitions, intelligence, precious opinions, hard-won expertise, reputation, everything within that desires a reward, a purpose, and an end. Solitude fits Jesus and us for the work of community. And so I invite you during this Lenten season to make some space for solitude. Take to a journal. Take a walk. Listen to music without any other distraction. Watch the wind through the trees. Pray. Meditate. Do not fill up this time with podcasts or TV or games of solitaire. Rather, sit quietly and invite God to show up as God wills. You may want to start with a timer, give yourself 10 minutes or so, and add a little time every single time you sit in some solitude. Discover the wilderness within. Discover the devil that bedevils you. Discover the wild beasts that roam in their hunger and their beauty. Discover that angels are waiting upon you. Sit in solitude and be transformed. One tool for such solitude might be singing to ourselves as well. We sang this piece of music during the Christmas season, so we're going to pull it out again. Be still and know that I am God. We'll repeat it a few times in the spirit of quiet solitude.